Susan and I are trying to figure out
Yeah.
our stuff.
I hear the other Tony on yeah. But Kelsey, is Kelsey here?
Safe drive south, Commissioner.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, drive safe.
Okay, so I just have to let you guys know before we get started, we have 1 minute. I am not showing, I'm in a different browser than normal. I cannot find a video option and my video is not off. My white light's going good. Let me see here.
I also do not have a video option. I don't
Okay,
know
so it's
why,
not just me.
but no.
All right. And in this browser, I'm not getting multiple view options. I'm only getting whoever's speaking options.
Same here.
Okay.
That's same for me. I don't know if you can hear me. This is Commissioner Mark Stockamp.
Hey, Mark, how you doing?
Doing
Alrighty,
good.
so my laptop shows that it is 5:30, so at this point, I will call to order the Deschutes County Planning Commission meeting for Thursday, December 12th. And the first item on the agenda is the approval of minutes for August 8th, August 22nd, September 26th, and October 10th. Because we are approving so many different minutes, I would like to take a different approach as we've had different people attending all across the board. At this point, do any commissioners have any objections or changes that they would like to the minutes of the meetings they attended? With that being said, I would like to call a blanket approval across all the minutes approved by the commissioners attending the specific meetings they were at. Does that meet everyone's approval?
Yes.
Yep.
Excellent.
Yes.
Alrighty. Okay. So we have approved the minutes. And I'm going to take it that we have in attendance Vice Chair Curis. Via Zoom, we have myself and Commissioners Altman and Stockamp. I was under the impression that Commissioner Cyrus would not be available. And I do not know the whereabouts of Commissioners Hovkamp or Kelly.
Hofkamp's here in person.
Terrific. Excellent. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Okay, so excellent. We do have a quorum. Alrighty, at this point, is there anyone present in public or online who would like to make a public comment? That does not pertain to tonight's agenda.
I'm seeing no's from our tech team.
Excellent. I appreciate that, Vice Chair. So at this point, we will move on to item 4, and we will start with action item number 1, the work session Clear and Objective Housing Text Amendments by Kyle Collins, Associate Planner.
Yeah. Good evening, commissioners. For the record, Kyle Collins, Associate Planner.
And Kyle, I'm going to stop you real quick right there, just because I just noticed that the screen when you started talking is still showing that the meeting will begin shortly. So maybe that's something why we can't see one another.
Gotcha. Give us 1 second to do some troubleshooting here.
You bet. Thank you.
Madam Chair, has the video corrected itself? This is Peter Gutowski.
Yep, it sure has. We can now see you.
Okay, great.
Doesn't mean that I've figured out how to see myself, though.
All right, one more second here.
Okay, I'm seeing some stuff now kind of going on.
Yeah, can everybody see the presentation on the screen at this point? It looks like it's fine on my end.
Yep.
Yes.
Yes. However, when someone is talking, we see that as the little small icon up top. So we have your PowerPoint or whatever they're called these days, and then whoever's talking at the top. So we will just be incognito this evening.
Sure. We'll continually try to troubleshoot, I think, as we go along here. All right. One more time for the record, I am Kyle Collins, Associate Planner with Deschutes County. And tonight, this is a work session in preparation for an upcoming public hearing. And this is regarding our clear and objective housing text amendments. So the Planning Commission has been informed that this project has kind of been going on in the background for several months now. We're just formally kicking off sort of the public process portion of this. So before we actually dive into the specifics of what we're going to go over tonight, I'll give some apologies. This is a pretty huge packet. I'm sure all of you already saw. It's multiple hundreds of pages. A vast majority of those pages contain what I'll call relatively minor edits. You're talking about things like punctuation, word replacements, etc. So really, we're only going to go over a small subset of what's been proposed here. And then there's knock-on changes that we're forced to incorporate as we've changed things like our definitions, for example, which is one of the big pieces that we're going to undergo. It's going to be relatively technically dense, so more apologies there, but unfortunately, that's just the nature of this project. So first thing I'll point out is we have a project webpage and the full record. All the materials, including the application materials that are a part of your packet tonight, can be found there as well. You can see the URL here on the page. And first, I'll do a little bit of background and overview of why we're moving forward with this project at all. So starting in 2017, the Oregon State Legislature passed a series of bills that were intended to promote the production of housing in the state. Pretty sure everyone's familiar that we're undergoing something of a housing crisis sort of nationwide, and that's acutely true here in Central Oregon as well. And so a number of these bills were intended to remove regulatory hurdles that the legislature saw as being in place at a local level. Majority of those bills ultimately modified the Oregon Revised Statutes, or the ORS, Section 197.307, in very specific ways. And generally, it limits local governments to using only what are described as clear and objective standards, conditions, and procedures which regulate the development of housing, including what they call needed housing. And generally what that means is any adopted standards may not have the effect of discouraging any needed housing through unreasonable cost or delay. So initially, those clear and objective housing standards only applied to our incorporated cities. Those are places with acknowledged urban growth boundaries statewide. But starting in 2023, a House Bill 3197 was passed and expanded those clear and objective housing statutes to include unincorporated communities, non-resource lands, and areas zoned for rural residential use. So essentially what we're talking about now is all of the areas that we would describe as rural Deschutes County, with the exception of resource lands. So these clear and objective housing statutes do not apply to places like exclusive farm use zone properties, forest zone properties, and similar resource zone properties that are governed by a different set of state statutes. So really we're talking about our RR10 zone, our MUA10 zone, places like Tumalo, Terrebonne, our unincorporated communities, and similar places that have largely already seen housing development over time. So the provisions of that House bill that I referenced, 3197, they become officially effective on July 1st of next year. So they're not actually in place until that date crosses. But as it applies to housing development, any non-resource zone properties, if there is zoning code language that has discretionary language included after that July 1st date of next year, they can essentially be ignored by applicants hoping to pursue the development of housing. So it doesn't apply to things like commercial style developments, but if you come and say you want to build a dwelling unit of some kind, and there's some standard that has discretionary language, that applicant can effectively ignore that standard. So what does clear and objective language actually mean? It obviously kind of is self-evident in some way. It says it in the name, but generally we're talking about standards like terms or definitions and measurements that provide for a consistent interpretation. So generally there's no need for discretion on the part of whoever the reviewer, in this case, planning staff, would be in undertaking that particular standard. So what we've described it as previously is if two people were put in separate rooms and they saw the same proposed development and had the same set of standards, they would reach the exact same conclusion when applying that development. So there's a variety of approaches you can do to arrive at clear and objective standards, and I'll go through a couple of these. You can use things like true-false standards. Those are, you can think of most basically, is a use allowed in a particular zone or not? So you can say, are dwellings allowed in a zone, or are they not allowed in a particular zone? That's an example of kind of an on-off true-false statement. You can use counts and measurements. These are things that we deal with on a very frequent basis, have specific quantitative measurements. You can imagine things like the height of a structure having a specific identified limit. In this case, the majority of properties in Deschutes County have a height limit of 30 feet for any proposed structures. And then finally, you can use things that we describe as lists or menus. So you can imagine saying that proposed developments could move forward if one of the following items is included or none of the following items are included, where you're setting out a specific objective list of items that have to be included or not included in order to move forward. And as long as you can prove that one of those has been included, then that still qualifies as a clear and objective standard. So I'll move into the more specific proposal and methodology for what we're bringing forward here today. So we obviously have pretty significant language within the existing Deschutes County Code that affects or could affect the development of housing that doesn't meet the objective, the threshold for clear and objective standards. And so we've gone through quite literally the entirety of both our Title 18, that's our zoning code that we're generally dealing with on a day-to-day basis, but as well as some other areas that deal with our subdivision ordinances, Title 19 areas, which deal with properties surrounding the city of Bend. And we tried to call out which pieces of language do not comply with those clear and objective standard thresholds. But we tried to break that up into distinct segments because obviously we realize if we were to put this forward as just one complete package, that's kind of an avalanche of stuff coming on top of this. So we tried to segment it out in distinct ways, hopefully to give you the opportunity to digest this in a meaningful manner, as well as the members of the public. So this First Amendment package that we're going to be talking about tonight will address the following areas. The first and probably the most impactful are the definitions associated with the Deschutes County Zoning Code. That's again our Title 18, as well as the Bend Urban Growth Boundary Zoning Ordinance, our Title 19 areas. We're going to talk about dimensional standards for both Titles 18 and 19. And then finally, we're going to talk about accessory structure standards for both of those titles. Generally, we've tried to preserve all existing uses that are currently in the code, but modifying and clarifying language that could be perceived as discretionary or is discretionary with clear and objective standards. So we have not undertaken any type of policy decisions regarding which uses should or should not be allowed under this process. That's not the goal. It truly is, we're trying to find a like for like comparison between what's currently in the code and what will be true moving forward, but clarifying some of those discretionary standards or eliminating them where possible. So before I move forward with the amendments, maybe I'll take a pause to see if anybody has questions around that background. I know it's kind of a crash course in everything that led us to this point, but. All right, hearing nothing, I will move forward. One question. Sure.
The chair is muted, by the way, Chair. You're muted.
And I was just going to ask if anyone had any questions.
I do, Chair. Thank
Alrighty.
you. Kyle, maybe you're getting to this, and I don't think I recall seeing it in the packet, but when we're done with the various chunks of this, or when you all are done with it, is there a state review or acknowledgement, or it's just kind of, it's internal. We think that it's clear and objective, and the proof will be in the pudding when.
So technically, any proposed changes to our zoning code go through a review by the Department of Land Conservation and Development. So we've actually already submitted a copy of the proposal that you see here before to our DLCD liaison, and they have the opportunity to review and provide comments throughout this entire process up to the point of adoption. And then they have the opportunity to provide comments even after that point as well.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Alrighty, let's
So,
proceed.
Chair Will
Oh.
Groves has come to the front area. It seems that he might have something he wants to add.
Thanks, Vice
Alrighty.
Chair. Record Will
Yeah.
Groves, your planning manager. Just to elaborate a little bit on that question, DLCD will have an opportunity to tell us that we've done it wrong, but they won't tell us that we've done it right specifically. So what'll happen is that as we try to adopt this code, it could be subject to facial challenges. So someone might say that, that this code is not clear and objective that you're adopting, and they could appeal our efforts to make those changes to the code into this, into the state land use system. And the other thing that could happen is that we could see as applied challenges. So, it could be at the time of adoption, nobody saw any problem with it. But later on, someone could say, hey, as you're applying this, it's causing a problem that's not resulting in clear objective results. So it may be years down the way that we find out that, what we did was either, wrong or insufficient. And one of the difficulties that we're dealing with right now is that case law is all over the place about what's sufficient for these purposes. We've made some reasoned assumptions in coordination with our legal counsel, as well as talking to our peers around the state. But there are, I think we're going to see a lot of case law in the coming years. And I'll bet you dollars to donuts that we'll be back in front of you trying to fix some of these things in future meetings.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll also point out that for better or for worse, there's not like a model code to do this. So every jurisdiction's kind of been left in the wind to figure out how and when to do this. I mean, obviously we have the deadline of July 1st, but this is truly a case by case basis, depending on how much capacity. We just happen to be a jurisdiction that has enough capacity to tackle this. A lot of jurisdictions are not necessarily even trying this at this point. So we'll see. With that, I'll go into some of the specifics of these proposed amendments. Again, just given the sheer scale of some of this, I'm not going to go through every single proposed amendment line by line. I'm going to give more of a general summary of those three areas: the definitions, dimensional standards, and accessory structures that I referenced earlier. And then, of course, if you have questions, interrupt me at any point. So the first thing I'll talk about are our proposed definitions amendments. As you can imagine, definitions are really the foundational principle for our development and zoning code. However, there are numerous terms within our existing definitions which do contain language which is at best ambiguous and sometimes directly contradictory to the requirements of a clear and objective housing standard. So an example I pointed out here is we use the term family throughout portions of the definition, even within our included single family dwelling unit definition. It's one of the terms that we use pretty frequently. And family does not have an agreed upon definition. It's actually been subject to constitutional challenges. And so those are the types of terms that we're ultimately trying to excise from the code. So to address all this, we propose some amendments to our definitions under the following methodology. This isn't purely comprehensive, but is intended to give you, this is how we thought about it in a step-by-step, basically from the most easy to things that require not policy decisions, but they fall within a kind of a gray area of trying to apply these new clear and objective standards. So the first proposed methodology is if there's an existing or a newly included term that has another definition that comes from the Oregon Revised Statutes, we've adopted that term directly as either a reference in statute or we pulled in the language verbatim into our existing code. The reason we've done that is we have reason to believe, in conversation with our legal counsel, that those pieces of ORS terminology are actually, they supersede the requirements for some of these clear and objective standards. Because as you can imagine, at the state level, they have their own versions of lots of different definitions. And because definitions cover a lot of different ground, there is always going to be at least some portion of discretionary language included in there. There's going to be some judgment calls in some areas. And our feeling at this point is as long as we're relying on the ORS language where we can shield challenges against those particular pieces of terminology. The second piece is if a definition has subjective language that could have some type of measurable or quantitative standards, then we've added in new measurements or specific outlines of quantitative standards where possible. So for example, we use terms like designed for or adequate for throughout lots of portions of the code. And generally we understand just kind of through the legislative history or how it's embedded in context that saying something is designed for usually means it has a specific set of measurements associated with that. That's how you can judge whether something has been designed for or is adequate for in certain cases. That's not always true, which leads us to the third methodology, which is if an existing term has criteria which could reasonably interpreted in multiple ways. So for example, what constitutes a cooking area or a kitchen, then we've added explicit directions on how to interpret the standard within either the definition itself, or we've added new terms entirely that weren't previously included in the code to clarify some of those ambiguities in the existing definition. In this case, we previously did not have a definition for what would constitute a kitchen, but we would propose a new piece of terminology that explicitly outlines what is a kitchen and what components fall into a kitchen. The fourth methodology is if we had two or more existing terms that offered conflicting interpretations. So the examples I provided are we use the terms lot width and lot depth to mean similar things, but they're not perfectly overlapped. Same is true of yard versus setback. We use those terms kind of interchangeably throughout the code. We tried to collapse those competing terms into a single term to remove any unintended conflict that previously wasn't intended to be there. It just kind of built up over time as the code developed. And then finally, if an existing term has language which has been previously deemed unconstitutional or otherwise unlawful, I referenced single family dwelling earlier is probably the most prominent example of this. Then we've modified those terms to remove whatever the offending language is. So in the case of family, we've taken family entirely out of dwelling unit, and a single family dwelling has been reduced to just a single unit dwelling, in which case the relationships between the persons inhabiting that dwelling is no longer addressed as part of the definition or its application elsewhere in code. Some more general statements about methodology. We obviously have certain terms in the existing code which have been subject to numerous interpretive challenges. So we've had lots of arguments with different applicants over the years over what types of development constitute a structure. For example, is a hot tub a structure? That's a pretty frequent one that comes up. Are fences structures? Are certain types of earth moving structures? There's all kinds of different challenges that have been brought up over the years. And where possible, we've attempted to move in interpretive decisions that have been made either by Deschutes County hearings officers or the Board of County Commissioners to align with those new proposed definitions. So we have previous law internally that says you should interpret this in a specific way, and we've attempted to list that explicitly within the definitions themselves. And then finally, as I referenced at the very beginning, because definitions obviously propagate throughout the entire area of the code, we've had to go through line by line and essentially make sure that each new proposed definition actually makes sense in context where it's used line by line for each instantiation in other areas of the code. Hence why you have a 700-ish page packet of materials, because we basically had to go through and say, if I say dwelling unit here, does it mean the same thing in every single instantiation? Or do we need to modify the language in that particular area? So that's a lot just regarding definitions. So maybe I'll pause and see if there are any questions. I know, again, very technical and kind of heavy things to talk about.
Chair Williams, would you mind if I ask another brief question?
Not at all, not at all.
Just curious, Kyle, I'm sure you're going to get to it, but I don't know. I'll jump the gun a little bit. I noticed home was replaced with dwelling throughout. So home is a problematic term as well as family.
It's more the case if we had, again, to go back to that, if we had competing uses that mean roughly the same thing, we've tried to align them into a single term. And through various discussions throughout our current planning staff, our long range planning staff, conversations with the building division, for example, we tried to just land on what's the most clear term. And we decided that was dwelling unit.
Dwelling. Oh, okay. What? Fair
Yeah,
enough.
so dwelling unit became kind of the catch-all term for a residential use or a home. And then we have different varieties of dwelling units that you might see, like a duplex, a multi-unit dwelling. You can kind of go down the rabbit hole of different types of dwelling units, but that is the underlying bedrock of what we decided a home was.
I'm not going to adopt that. I'm not going to my dwelling after this.
Yeah,
But thank you for that explanation.
of course. All right, unless there's other questions, I'll move on to the dimensional standards discussion. So as I referenced earlier, dimensional standards can be categorized really as any kind of specific quantitative measurement standard that applies throughout the code. We deal with these a lot. They come up obviously when we're talking about things like setbacks. That's probably one of the most frequent things that we discuss. But it covers a pretty broad variety of things that we deal with when reviewing development. You're talking about lot coverage standards. So how much area of a property can you cover in structures? The height of structures, how tall can a structure be? What's the floor area of a structure? Like, how do you measure how big a structure actually is? Those are all things that I've been describing as dimensional standards. However, we have some existing language in our code. It's not that the individual standards themselves are not clear and objective, but the application of them can become quite ambiguous depending on how you parse the language. So there's a lot of overlap here with changes to definitions, but it does, I think, warrant breaking them out as a little bit of a separate discussion, because this is one of the things we deal with most frequently when reviewing development. So I'll give some examples here that I think can spell this out. So probably the biggest one that we have talked about internally is, how do you measure the height of a structure? And it turns out there are a lot of different ways you could do that. So our current definitions in the code, you can see here, we describe the height of a building as the vertical distance from the grade to the highest point of the roof. And then we go on further to describe what grade is. And it's the average of the finished grade for elevations of all walls of a building. And then there's some specific call outs for things like our landscape management combining zone. But I mocked up some very simple graphics to maybe show you why that could be complicated. So here's kind of a silhouette of a house on some irregular topography. And how would you measure the height of this building? Would you take 3 measurements kind of roughly in the middle, one at either end, and average them together? What if there are wings of a building that stretch out outside of this as a 2-dimensional image, but outside in either direction? Do you start taking measurements along those wings as well? How many different points do you need to measure from before you can say you've achieved an accurate average across this entire structure? We've had plenty of conversations internally across staff and given people like, how do you measure the height of a structure when you're reviewing building plans? And it turns out it depends on who you ask, how much into the weeds they go in determining the height. And it probably depends on how close they are to that maximum generally of 30 feet, how much rigor you actually going to put into reviewing these. Some other kind of hypothetical examples. What if you like really put this on crazy topography, and you can see that if you're building on a very steep slope and you're really building down the slope where that's allowed, it can really start to skew what the height of a particular structure looks like. Mm-hmm. And so you can see where those ambiguities obviously come up. And so to try to resolve some of that, we've proposed some definitions that we think clarify it and make it clear both for our staff and reviewing developments, as well as people that are actually moving forward with developments, which is who this entire clear and objective process is supposed to help when trying to construct a home, to make sure that everybody knows what the standard is and what they need to present in order for it to be reviewed clearly. So in this case, we are redefining height, specifically as it pertains to structures, which is the vertical distance from average grade to the point of a structure. We're redefining grade to simply mean the elevation of the ground surface. And then finally, we're adding in what's the definition of average grade, which is, when we're talking about structural height, it's the average of 2 points, which is the highest finished grade abutting the structure and the lowest average grade abutting the structure or finished grade abutting the structure. So what that would look like in practice, we go back to that last kind of hypothetical example, is we are literally looking at the lowest elevation where structure occurs on the property. We're measuring that to the highest point in the structure. And we're doing the same thing for the highest elevation adjacent to the structure and taking an average of those 2 points. And then you get a number. If that falls below whatever the identified threshold is, 30 feet most of the time, then that project could move forward as proposed. We feel that's a relatively simple solution. It is clear and objective, presumably, for both applicants as well as staff, and there's no way to game the system, so to speak, by building a strange structure that could be evaluated in several different ways. We've obviously had to add in some additional definitions to deal with this specific example. So things like what is a finished grade versus an existing grade, et cetera. And I'll also point out, given that we removed that portion of language dealing with the landscape management combining zone from that previous height definition that you might remember earlier, I'll point out that we have a future package that's forthcoming that's just going to deal with Deschutes County's Goal 5 resources. So we've tried to not touch those Goal 5 resources through this definitions and dimensional structures or dimensional standards package at this point in time. So we've maintained that general standard in the code, but it is likely to see some changes at a future date. So I'll stop there because I know another heavy topic, and that's the second of the big three, to see if there's questions.
Any questions? All right.
Okay. I'll move on to the last one, which is dealing with accessory uses. This is maybe the most nuanced of the three that we're going to cover. Because clear and objective standards are going to be required starting next year for all types of housing development, one of the big things that we need to clarify is distinguishing what constitutes a dwelling unit or a dwelling use on a particular property, and structures or uses that may be considered accessory to either a dwelling unit or accessory to some other use on a property. So a barn, a detached garage, a detached shop building, those are types of development that we also review that don't necessarily have to meet the standards for clear and objective development. So we have to kind of have two separate lanes for reviewing some of these items. Most zones in Deschutes County only allow the establishment of one dwelling unit on site. That doesn't include things like accessory dwelling units, obviously, which we've recently adopted into code. But in most circumstances, if we're looking at a particular property, they're going to be limited to a single dwelling unit. That tends to be the case countywide in most instances. But it's pretty challenging to implement some sections of our code when we're reviewing applications, because oftentimes people propose things that fall sort of in a gray area of a dwelling unit or an accessory structure. So you can imagine one of the things that comes up a lot is, let's say I want to build a detached shop structure, but I want some components of a dwelling unit in that structure to make it more useful. I want to add in a bathroom. I want to add in maybe laundry facilities. And then you start to tiptoe even further into the definitional gray area of, what if I want to add in a kitchen? That starts to just look like a dwelling at a certain point. Hence the proposal for really trying to clarify what is in a dwelling unit and what components factor into that, either in aggregate or individually, and which things can or cannot be allowed within accessory structures. That's really the distinction that we're trying to make. This is a pretty perennial problem that we deal with almost on a daily basis, essentially, when reviewing development. Historically, if somebody came forward with one of these kind of definitional gray area developments, we've tried to reduce legal risk, primarily to future property owners, but also to the county itself in some way, either through specifically land use decisions or formal land use decisions where we make them tell us, what do you want to use this structure for? And have that cataloged in a formal decision that's then recorded with the property. Or more commonly, what we would do is record legal documents for the property that are intended to effectively warn future property owners that even though you have a building on site that has, let's say, laundry facilities and a full bathroom attached, that's not intended to be used as a dwelling unit. We call those documents restrictive covenants in most cases. And basically they say the zoning on this particular property only allows for one single dwelling unit. unless you go through subsequent land use approval that might supersede that in some manner. So that if a new owner 5 years after that structure is built buys the property, they do a title report search, they would see that document come up and say, oh, I understand that I'm not actually allowed to use this as a dwelling unit, even if it has the characteristics of such. However, that's relatively complicated, as you can imagine, because people sometimes don't want to do that. And our code, because it is ambiguous and didn't have some of these clear and objective standards, it's difficult to show people why that may be risky, both in terms of their own legal risk as well as future property owners. And so what amendments we proposed here kind of fall into 3 big steps. First, we're going to outline which components, when taken together, constitute a dwelling unit. Those primarily are going to be kitchens, full baths, and internal accessibility between all areas of the structure itself. So basically saying that all bedrooms have to have access to all other components of the dwelling unit. So you can't have satellite bedrooms that can't reach a kitchen, for example, that can only be reached from the outside of the dwelling unit. Each of those components in turn have been further defined within our definition section. The second piece of this is we're going to outline which components may be allowed within accessory structures. And as a part of that, we're going to establish a formal process to ensure that accessory structures are not unlawfully converted to or otherwise used for dwelling purposes. So essentially, we're going to say, these are the components that you can have within an accessory structure. And there's a threshold built into that that says, let's say you have 2 of these 5 different items. Once you've reached that threshold, then you're required to record a restrictive covenant so that, again, future property owners understand that you've got a full bath and laundry facilities in your detached shop building. That's perfectly fine, but it needs to be essentially registered with the property that you can't turn that into a dwelling unit unless you were to go through some type of formal land use approval that allowed that use. Next thing I'll talk about is our public and agency comments, which not a lot to say here, but I'll back up and stop there if there are questions around those accessory unit discussions.
Questions? Okay.
Public and agency comments. We've essentially just started this process in the last few weeks. And although we've had some informal conversations as we're been building this package with our other departments, for example, our building division, our road department, we don't have any formal comments to date, but I expect that to change likely before the public hearing process in January. So more to come on that. And then finally, as I referenced earlier, I just wanted to hit this again, which is this first package is the first of likely several different packages of code modifications dealing with clear and objective that are going to be forthcoming in the coming months. And I'll point out that the upcoming text amendments are going to deal with our subdivision and partition standards. Those are our titles 12 and 17 in our current code. Our goal 5 resources, which I referenced earlier. So those are all the things dealing with our natural resources in Deschutes County. That includes our landscape management combining zone, our wildlife area combining zone, things of that nature. We're going to be specifically dealing with cluster and plan development standards. These don't come up a lot, but cluster and plan developments are basically a special carve out within our code that allow for increased density or different development patterns that might otherwise be used rather than the simple one house on 10 acres that we generally see throughout the county. And then finally, we have some other kind of tertiary sections that occasionally deal with housing, but don't exclusively deal with housing that we're going to try to correct over time as well. So all that's forthcoming sometime between now and in the beginning of July when we're required to have these things in place. And next steps, our public hearing before the commission is slated for January 9th. And I have the URL for the public website for this project so that anyone can see the record materials included there. And I've got my contact information in case anyone has questions. With that, I'll take any questions that commissioners may have.
Are there any commissioners who have questions? Commissioner Altman?
Thank you, Chair. first of all, Kyle, this is amazing work and it's very, very professional and very detailed, and I'm very impressed. So I had a question about page 193 and then 194 through 210 that is with regard to Lapine. Essentially 194 through 210 were just intended to be, are all strike through. Is that because Lapine is now a city?
That is a great question, and that is exactly the answer.
Okay.
Yeah, so because Lapine is now an incorporated city, there are numerous sections of our development code which are effectively no longer applicable. We no longer have jurisdiction in those areas. There are a few call-out areas of Lapine that we are required to maintain sections of our code. So you can think of our neighborhoods 3 and 4, if you're familiar with that Lapine area. We've maintained those sections of the code. But for those portions that are now governed entirely by the city of Lapine's code, we've coordinated with them and confirmed that we can go ahead and strike those to reduce confusion and generally coordinate better between the county and the city.
Thank you.
Of course.
Any other questions?
I don't know if you can see Chair Williams, but I do. And this is Commissioner Hofkamp.
You bet.
Kyle, I don't know if you're going to cover this too, or if this is the terminal questions section, but how we've got the January 9th hearing coming up, and I would imagine that we do what we normally do in regards to hearings and listen respectfully, and down the road, maybe drill down on some of the issues that are brought up. But how does staff see the Planning Commission most productively engaged in this process? What are in an ideal world your expectations of us in helping with this?
I think generally at this point, I mean, now that you have hopefully an understanding of how we've proposed these edits, I think looking to, and at a certain point I can follow up before the hearing, maybe to give a little more concrete detail on like which pages of the packet to pay attention to. Maybe that would be helpful. But I think hopefully what we're looking for is look at the definitions that we propose. That's probably the biggest thing that we're changing. And you can see, you don't necessarily have to, obviously you're welcome to review the entire packet if you want, but really seeing how that language has changed and trying to understand, are there any kind of fatal flaws that we might have overlooked that might come up during something like a development review? You can imagine yourself in place of the public. You're representing the public, obviously. If I was going to come forward and I was going to try to build a house and I was implementing the standard and I wanted to go to the development code, would I understand how to use it? And in some ways, you are a stand-in for the person on the street trying to review those standards. And the same is true for things like our dimensional standards that we talked about earlier, as well as those accessory uses being kind of the big 3 to pay attention to. I think hopefully that is, I don't know that if you want to go into the level of detail, providing like a line by line edit, that's certainly welcome. And we can take any comments that you want. But I think generally we're looking, is the methodology sound, and are there fatal flaws if I was imagining like hypothetical development review examples?
Okay. And that actually, that goes to my second question, which is, well, first of all, in addressing your answer there, you are going through it as a team of professional planners, and then you've got legal counsel too. So do my best to bring any additional value there, but that's pretty intimidating to think. But and then the other question is, what would an unproductive Planning Commission engagement with this process look like? And I think you've just carefully hinted at one, which might be a line by line review of 700-page first tranche, and then however many hundreds of pages we have in subsequent tranches coming. I'm not sure how productive that might be.
I mean, certainly I can't tell you not to do that, obviously,
Yeah.
if you'd like to. I think probably the biggest thing that we want to make sure is clear that I reference in the presentation is these are not intended to be policy decisions. So we're not talking about what uses do you think should or should not be allowed.
Okay.
It's truly just intended to be an apples to apples translation of, we're not changing what uses are allowed, but we are clarifying standards that previously had ambiguous language.
Now that's helpful. That's good clarity. Yeah. Thanks.
If I may, as I look at Vice Chair Kiris, just to build on that concept, I think as we get into the later stages of this code amendment, Goal 5 has provisions that always generate a lot of opinion. And again, to the extent that individual planning commissioner has strong opinions about the intent, the longstanding policy, we would respectfully ask to kind of resist that temptation to, look at changing that policy. I think it's certainly important to identify that as a parking lot issue. For example, if you think like the landscape management combining zone, really should be changed in a fundamental way. Let's note that. And that can be a topic that informs a work plan. If that was, generated a lot of interest and a lot of support for such a significant change. But just as what Kyle mentioned, right now we're just honoring the intent of the code as it's written today. And to go beyond that scope, given the multiple iterations of this amendment, I mean, there's 3 separate plan amendments or code amendments that this planning commission is going to receive. Try to stay true to just the intent of the existing language, and as issues come up from the public that are looking at fundamental changes to the overall program, let's note that. Let's put it in a parking lot, and then that can be revisited at a subsequent time. As the planning commission, anybody who's watching online, as members of the public, we have an action plan from the comprehensive plan update process that identifies topics that are worthy of revisitation. This entire public hearing process could bring up other items, since it's been a while since you've had essentially an audit of our code as it pertains to housing. So I don't want to diminish viewpoints or opinions about how the code is structured today, but we won't be able to extricate ourselves from this process if we try to add on elements to it that look at policy redirection. So I appreciate the question and the response from Kyle, and I'm just re-emphasizing it. Of course, the planning commission is an independent advisory body, but that's what we would respectfully offer for your consideration going into the hearings that start next year.
Yeah, no, that actually helps a lot. And I'll probably have to be reminded that at some point if I start, especially goal 5, as you alluded to, which interests me as well as other commissioners. If I start going off into opinion and policy, feel free to remind and say, hey, this is a language clarification. Remind you that we're after clarification of clear and objective standards. Last follow-up on that, and if you don't know at this point, that's fine. But is there a particular section of the code that you think is going to be the most challenging in regards to clear and objective?
The goal 5 resource.
It is, okay.
Yeah. Just because, I mean, as you can imagine, it's very difficult to turn essentially what amounts to almost base level discretionary standards into a clear and objective version that maybe everybody would agree on, that maybe it accomplishes the same goal. I'm not going to speak to that right now because there's a future conversation waiting there, but that's almost certainly to generate probably the most interest from the public, as well as a lot of brain power has already gone into how to solve some of these problems. And there are some real kind of roadblocks associated with some of that. So more to come, I would say.
What I would like to say, and yes, I did go through the 700 some pages, but all I literally looked for was the aqua blue, underlined as added or striked out as omitted. And that's really what we're looking at. We are not looking at anything that's not in aqua blue. We're purely looking at text amendment. And in that regard, it's like yard versus setback, dwelling unit versus residence, and then some of the other nuances of the definition. So yeah, the definitions are, I think, by far the most important part of this text amendment change. I just had one silly wordsmith, and it was page 51, item D, and it's the removal regarding lakes, rivers. And item D says, does not include, shall not include. And I think one of those needed, I think it just, we want does not include versus shall not include. And I think one thing just didn't get struck out. And that was just the only thing I really saw. Even though
No,
I thought it was interesting, some of the properties in Widgie have more than 2 street fronts. They've got 3 street fronts. So you have a 30 setback, a 20 setback, and a 20 setback. But you guys did a fantastic job going through this first section, and I know you've just put tons of time into it. So with that being said, are there any other questions for Kyle?
I have one
Like-
question for Kyle.
You bet. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm just curious what the timing is for the county with the July 1st, 2025 effective date. And you said this is the first of what could be many packages. So we're the first step. The planning commission then goes on to the county commission. But I was just curious, is there any sort of timing deadlines the county has for trying to get stuff adopted prior to this July 1?
I mean, really, the July 1 is the true deadline.
Mhm.
Obviously, we'd like to have it well through the planning commission process before that, because we have to go to the board and have another public process. But I would expect, just in terms of what you should be looking forward to, is come the new year, I think a lot of these packages are going to start coming in lockstep. So those subdivision partition ordinances, I think, are very likely to be the next thing that you'll see in front of you. I don't know exactly when that'll happen. It's going to depend on scheduling
So
and that nature.
I guess my question is this January 9th planning commission meeting, is this the first of several public hearings for clear and objective standards for us?
It is indeed, yes.
Okay, yeah, and we're gonna have all those hosted then before it gets passed on to county. I assume it all has to be, all the packages come in front of us before it'll go to any county commission meeting.
That's correct. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you'll have the opportunity to provide your recommendations. We've tried to, again, break this up into packages, because presenting you with thousands of pages of underlined strikeouts and having a coherent conversation, excuse me, is already difficult, even in just this subsection. And this is about as condensed as we could make something this technical.
Got it. Thanks for clarifying.
Of course.
Any other questions? All righty, Planner Collins, fantastic job. We appreciate your time this
Yeah.
evening.
Chair, Peter Gutowski actually has his hand raised.
Okay,
I just wanted to get another value add.
and if you could get closer to your microphone. We're just having a hard time on our side hearing it.
No worries.
Perfect.
There's a microphone that's missing where I'm sitting. Well, thank you again for letting me provide another value added comment. Again, for the record, Peter Gutowski, Community Development Director. To Commissioner Stockcamp's question just about the sequencing and the number of hearings and looking or staring at a July 1st July 1st deadline. I just think it's important to acknowledge we're going to do the best we can. The Planning Commission needs to take the time necessary to review these packets of amendments. They will ultimately go to the Board of County Commissioners. The closer we get in the spring and into the May, we're getting into budget. Is there a possibility that or a handful of these amendments miss the July 1st deadline? Yeah, it's possible. But I think noted at the front end, I believe we're the first county that has initiated clear and objective standards. Washington County has been trying this for some time, and they've been in litigation for the amendments that pertain to lands within the metro boundary. But there are counties that are as sophisticated as Deschutes County that are already said, we're not going to be able to make the deadline because their codes, like ours or similar to ours, are incredibly complicated. And there's not a way to do a model code for 36 counties. So I just want to put that on the record. We're doing the best we can with the resources that we have. We'll get it as close to as possible to that July 1st deadline. And if it goes over, as Kyle's opening remarks noted, somebody has a project that has a housing element to it, they can respectfully navigate at the time, which would be discretionary standards, and rely on clear and objective standards. Now, I would presume that with good faith, showing that we're close to getting our package adopted by July 1st, that we won't run into that case. But if we do, that's understandable. This was a bit of an unfunded mandate, even though we got some funding from the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and Will and his team starting with Kyle, have done tremendous work, and it's a lot to be proud of. And we look forward to bringing it to you in its entirety next year.
Yeah, Kyle, and fine work. I'll reiterate and underline what my colleagues have already alluded to. That's a lot of detail work and fine work, and it's a heavy lift. And glad to see the Oxford commas. As a fan of those throughout.
Yeah, we tried to move towards that standard where possible.
All right, I think we're good here.
Well, thank you very much, commissioners. I will see you in January.
Thank you, Planner Collins. And item number 2 at the Newberry Country Plan, the 2025 update, Nicole Mardell.
Hello, commissioners. For the record, Nicole Mardell, Senior Planner with Deschutes County Community Development. I just have a verbal update for you this evening. It's relatively informal, but we wanted to keep you in the loop. So you had heard during our 2040 Comprehensive Plan update process, a strong desire to also update the Newberry Country Plan. So this plan was adopted in 2013. It's intended to provide region-specific background information, goals, and policies for the area south of Lava Butte to the southern county line, so quite a bit of Deschutes County. And it was really created to replace a previous document, which was the regional problem solving for South Deschutes County, and that was a bit more focused on nitrate-related issues. So the plan that we have today, it of course expanded beyond those nitrate issues, includes region-specific policies for things like economic development, housing, land use, natural hazards, etc. But it doesn't include Three Rivers, which was a big gap that I think we heard from community members. So we are preparing to update this document, kicking off that project in January of 2025. So we wanted to let you know our preliminary plan for this Newberry Country Plan update. In preparing for this update, I've been participating in the Lapine 2045 process. They're updating their city comprehensive plan. And there's also a grassroots community group called the Newberry Regional Partnership that's made up of a variety of business owners and community members in southern Deschutes County who have been working on a strategic plan. Both of those efforts have conducted quite a bit of community engagement to both rural residents and city residents in southern Deschutes County. So we've been reviewing a lot of that feedback, and it appears that there's really 3 main issues that are popping up for the community. Natural hazards, a lot of concern about wildfire, emergency preparedness, agency coordination, and development in the wildland urban interface in the WUI. Natural resources, lots of concern about availability and accessibility of water, similar to what we heard for the Deschutes County 2040 plan. But in addition to that, also concern about large-scale development, water quality, nitrate issues, wildlife, dark skies, and recreation, and kind of some more, I would say, regional concerns specifically about the Deschutes River. And then the last topic that I've seen quite a bit of feedback on is related to housing stability or security. So this is a lot of concern from both rural residents and city residents on housing development that's affordable, on houselessness issues, and how to maintain naturally occurring affordable housing. So things like manufactured homes or older homes. So we've seen a lot of input on those 3 key issues. And in kind of planning through our Newberry Country Plan update, we think it makes sense to focus in on these issues. So rather than have it be a full update like the 2040 Comprehensive Plan, we figured that we could focus in and try to get feedback on these 3 particular areas, while still, of course, having a bucket for any other issues that might pop up. So we are planning to have a relatively condensed update process beginning in January of 2025 and ideally wrapping up by December 2025. This includes about 3 phases of the project. The first I'm already working on and includes essentially a full update to all of the background information in the plan. So any existing conditions, projecting trends, information, involving updated studies, we're working on that now. And we're also creating a community engagement plan and communication strategy. And especially, I think what's unique about this project is that we do have that Newberry Regional Partnership. So we do have a network of really engaged community volunteers that I think we can partner with events on, which will be really helpful. The second phase, which would be from April to August, would focus on policy development. So this is very similar to what you did during the comprehensive plan update process. The Planning Commission, as I noted in my memo, you'd be serving as the advisory body for this project. So you'd be serving in two capacities. When we're developing the plan, you'd be our, informal advisory body. We'd provide regular updates to you. We'd share opportunities to, look at existing plan policy language and have iterative sessions to draft new language. You'd be reviewing, community engagement recaps, things like that. So you'd be involved in actually crafting the document on those three topics in particular. And then you'd move into your formal role as a hearings body once we have a draft of the document produced and we've initiated the post-acknowledgement plan amendment. So very similar to the 2040 plan. Wanted to note, we see kind of similar to the comprehensive plan, two opportunities for engagement, sort of an initial engagement of, hey, here are some of the issues that we've heard related to these three buckets. What do you think? Do we miss anything? Did we miss anything? And then the second round of engagement being more focused in on, here are the draft policies. What do you think? Are they effective? Do you have any proposed changes? And we are planning to use, again, both a mixture of in-person and virtual engagement opportunities as well. So we wanted to just give you that preliminary information now so that you're ready for it. But today it was just essentially our goal to introduce this topic to you, get you primed up for it, get you thinking about it, and we'll return to you in spring of 2025 with some of the updated existing conditions, background information, and more information on our community engagement approach. So with that, I welcome any questions from the Planning Commission.
Do any floor commissioners have any questions?
I do, Chair.
Yes.
First of all, I'm excited about this update to the Newberry Country Plan. Like a lot of folks in the room, South County enthusiast, it's beautiful country down there. And reading through the existing plan, it's very well written, and I can only imagine that the update will be an improvement. But just a question. So typical for these plans, there's a 20-year planning window on the existing plan, the 2012 to 2032. So we're a little bit past halfway, but typical also, I think, probably for reviews of those about the halfway point. So would the new one presumably be 2026 to 2046, or is that kind of the thought for the planning window for the new document?
Yeah, I think our goal would be to incorporate new information for that 20-year period. I do think when we were reviewing this internally, we do believe that there is some information in the policies that we believe is still current. So I think that that's why we chose to focus in on those three buckets, even though we're entering a new 20-year window. There's still some content in here that we feel is still sufficient today. But yes, it would be for that new 20-year window.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? And I'm just gonna make a comment, Nicole. I'm on the board of my special road district and was not aware that the county will partner with special road districts for road maintenance for those that provide emergency egress. And my neighborhood is a very quiet neighborhood, but we do provide egress in emergencies for Highway 97, Vanderbilt Road, and South Century. And I was not aware of that, and we've had situations in the past, and it's nice to know that my road district can necessarily approach the road district or the road department, is what this sounds like if we have issues. If I interpreted policy 11.2 correctly from the original.
Yeah,
So,
I think
and that's just a comment.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to be aware of. I'll admit I'm not familiar with kind of that coordination currently today, but I think that's
I
a great
wouldn't expect it.
that we can dig into, especially as part of the natural hazards.
Yeah,
focus
and I feel like maybe there are a number, because there are maybe, I think, 14 road districts down here or 19 road districts. And what a road district is, the county will not maintain your roads. So agency is formed by the neighborhood that becomes a county agency that has to answer to the state, but we are a government entity that can tax each property in order to maintain the road, snow plowing, gravel, grading, things like that. So that was just nice to know, and I look forward to what happens this spring with the Newberry Country Plan.
Excellent. Thank you.
Alrighty,
I
any
have
other
one more
questions?
question.
Yep.
Yeah. My question for the Newberry Country Plan, it's on the pages 804 to 811. It's the issue identification. I was kind of just curious what the process was for how and who they were collected from, because I know up above it was saying like property owners. It was showing kind of this whole web of things. And I was just curious, is this predominantly from property owners, kind of like the issue identification part, or was this also from stakeholder groups and stuff for the how all these issues were identified in the past?
A good question. I believe we do have the creator of that document here today. So
Oh.
Peter is provide a bit of info on that.
Great question, Commissioner Stockamp. You know, it's been a decade. And
Was it
so
2012 it looked like?
there was so much enthusiasm around Newberry Country Plan that it represented, there's a citizens action group that was in place at that time. I'm not sure if the CAG is what it was, the acronym, is still mobilized. But we had several open houses at the Lapine Senior Center and the Sun River Library at the Shark that allowed residents to communicate what they thought were the pressing issues facing that particular region or their particular neighborhood. So it was a combination, but the level of citizen involvement was extremely high, and I anticipate for the topics that staff has singled out, natural hazards, natural resources, housing, and I'm sure there'll be another category that kind of is a catch-all for topics that don't fit those three prominent issues. I think the Planning Commission can expect some extensive engagement. So it's a long response, but I would say it was my memory is more that those were communicated by residents as opposed to stakeholder groups, just given where we were at that time and the mobilization that had occurred to really champion a plan for this section of our county.
I
Great,
will say
thanks.
page 812 does list some of the agencies and organizations that provided input.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
I saw some of that. It was just
Yeah.
interesting because all the issues identified, there was just a lot of varying things. It's like, oh, I was curious if it was majority residents, other things. So it seemed like it received very well balanced citizen involvement, which is what we want to see. So.
And I think Three Rivers South is the most populous of the unincorporated non-city areas of Deschutes County as well. So there probably
Rivers-
was quite a bit of input.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Three Rivers is an interesting place. It's actually a census designated place for the census. So it's actually not an unincorporated community per our status from the state of Oregon kind of land use system.
Correct. Yes,
is
yes.
some-
I put words. Yes, we are not a community.
Yeah, so
Incorporated
it's
or
I think that'll
otherwise.
be, oh, thank you. Yeah, I think it'll be helpful for us to include some demographic information and a community profile. And I think that's what quite a few of the community members that I spoke to from Three Rivers wanted. They just wanted to see more representation in this document. So yeah, we'll be including that information as well.
Excellent. Any other questions? All right, Nicole, thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you in the new year.
Great, thank you.
All right, the next two topics will be discussed by Tanya Saltzman, Senior Planner. The first one being 2024 Rural Housing Profile.
Evening, planning commissioners. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, okay. It's always a gamble with these microphones here. For the record, my name is Tanya Saltzman. I'm a senior planner. The first item that I will be presenting is the 2024 Rural Housing Profile. I'm going to just share my screen, so bear with me for a moment, please. Had lots of technical difficulties presenting this the other day, so I'm here's hoping for this one. As I noted, I'm here to talk about the 2024 Rural Housing Profile. As we all know, as we've discussed already this evening, housing has consistently been identified as an issue in Deschutes County. That's no news to anybody. That's probably the case in many places that aren't Deschutes County. Staff first presented a version of this rural housing profile to both the Board of County Commissioners and the Planning Commission in 2020. I think a few of you were around. You might fondly remember it. So we did that in 2020. It was received well, and we decided as staff, under Director Peter Gutowski, to resurrect it and to update it as a meaningful tool to just give context to what's happening in the county, what's changed, just what it looks like out there. And I'll talk at the end of this about kind of the future plans for this. But so essentially what I've given you in your packet is an updated version of that 2020 profile. The report is intended to summarize existing conditions on a pretty high level. It's not meant to be super detailed or super exhausted or have the full, every single corner of the housing issue identified. It's just a high level, broad brush report about the current available data about everything that touches housing. So that's demographics, population projections, vacant residential lands, some market data, some discussion of kind of the constraints and opportunities within the Oregon land use system. With that, I'm just going to provide, I'm not going to go over every single page in that report, but I'm just going to provide some highlights from the report that we found interesting. So I'll start here with population projections. And this was table 5 in the report, if you're following along. As you can see, the last 2 columns in this table, so the average annual growth rate, which were split, this is projections from Portland State University. The first projection is from 2022 to 2047, and then the second is from 2047 to 2072. Across the board for the cities, you can see that growth it's still growing, but it's growing at a slower rate in that second chunk of time, in that 2047 to 2072. You can see the city of Bend, the growth rate for until 2047 is about 1.7%, but that's going to diminish to 1.4%. It is still growth, however. If you look at the bottom number in that, or the bottom line in the table, this is looking at the unincorporated county, so everything outside of the cities. Most of the jurisdiction that we deal with here, it's growing at a slower rate than those cities. And you'll see in that bottom right corner, it's actually projected to have negative growth. It's a very small amount, so unclear if it's statistically significant, but it is notable that it's quite a departure compared to the cities. And in general, that long-term growth rate slows compared to the short term, but in Deschutes County, the unincorporated county, that is a little more drastic, and that starts to touch down a little bit. So what does that mean? This slide looks at the proportion, the share of the county that the unincorporated county represents as opposed to the cities. We look at it for 2022, 2047, and 2072, which is a long time from now. However, you'll see that proportion of the county that's the rural county is understandably, if you consider the numbers that we just looked at, that's shrinking. So the share of the rural county by 2072 is going to be projected to be 16%. While on the other hand, the proportion that represents the cities will be increasing. Yeah, that's kind of the notable thing. So the jurisdiction that we as planners and we as community development department, that is shrinking, projected to shrink. Of course, anything could change, but. Now looking at housing tenure, so that's talking about owner-occupied units versus renter-occupied units. This table looks at both the numbers, the raw numbers, as well as the percentages for those. Owner-occupied, the highest percentage was within the city of Sisters. It's 65% of the housing units that are occupied are owner-occupied, with just 19% as renter-occupied. Lapine is a little more evenly balanced with 42% is renter-occupied. That's the highest percentage in the county. Something to note is these numbers don't necessarily, if you add the owner-occupied percentage plus the renter-occupied percentage, doesn't necessarily add up to 100%. Why is that? Possibly because of some of these homes are second homes or vacation homes or short-term rentals. They are not they're not being lived in as the primary dwelling, as their primary home. So if you look at the unincorporated county, excuse me, on the far right, you can see that a full 28% of homes are neither owner or renter occupied. This is likely due to the large amount of destination resorts. Not to say that, some people do live there full time, but a lot of those are second homes, vacation homes, rentals, vacation rentals, I should say. So that's just helping give a picture of the occupancy, what's happening in these homes. Are these homes, when we talk about, the housing crisis or people needing housing, where are they going and where, are these homes in the county necessarily being used to house people? Looking at the vacant land supply, now this, I'm not going to reproduce all the maps that were in your packet, but these are the numbers that are associated with those maps. We looked at the methodology for deriving this data is summarized in the report itself. But I just want to clarify that vacant land is not the same as buildable land necessarily. A buildable land analysis is a much more finely grained analysis. It takes into account a lot more factors, such as the individual site specifics, or if you could actually build a home there. This analysis that we did is simply looking at land that is not developed in these particular zones and in the resort areas. You can see, not surprisingly, that comparing 2020 numbers to 2024 numbers, the number of vacant lots decreased pretty much across the board, except for certain cases like the first one, the phase 2 of Caldera Springs came online. That wasn't around in 2020. The West Side Transit wasn't yet platted at that time. So there's a few things like that. But in general, the number of vacant lots reduced. Something that I'll note is that when I presented this to the Board of County Commissioners last week, I got a little bit of follow-up from Commissioner Chang, who pointed out that in certain cases, some land has been annexed into the city of Bend, and that land is now being developed at urban densities, such as the area around Stevens Road. So, this isn't necessarily the full picture. To see these numbers going down doesn't mean, oh my gosh, we're necessarily running out of vacant land. In certain cases, not all, it's gone over onto the city side. And so that's being subjected to different zoning, different densities. So there's a little bit of nuance there. And we did add that into the report, into a subsequent version that was not in your packet. But I'm happy to share that when that's done. Just a few sentences talking about that. Onto the market analysis. This data was provided by CORE, Central Oregon Association of Realtors. This is looking at sales price, average sale price between September 2023 and September 2024. I'll also note it's average and not median. So there are some potentially funky things in there, but these are what we went with for now. Future analysis, we might look at the median because, one ginormous sale could really throw things off a little bit. But the numbers are generally pretty high. I know that's a very unscientific analysis there, but to look at the average sale price in Bend in 2023 to 2024 was $1.2 million. And again, these are things that are actually transacted on the market. It doesn't mean the value of all the homes that are kind of sitting around, but these are the actual sale prices. Manufactured homes were also quite high. And I'll summarize this on the next slide. Most rural single-family dwelling sales averaged over $700,000, with the exception of Lapine that averaged about $508,000. The manufactured homes averaged in the mid $300,000 to almost $500,000. That's $500,000 for manufactured homes. Unsurprisingly, Bend had the most real estate activity, and homes in the newer destination resorts have sold for the highest amounts. So we have Tetherow and things like that, as opposed to the older resorts. Now transitioning a bit to just the existing residential opportunities. This is just I discussed this more in the actual report, but just the tools that Deschutes County has available to it to provide housing in some form. This is provided by Oregon state law, or in certain cases, there's, specific things to Deschutes County that we as a county has taken advantage of from state law or what have you. So these are just ways that you can get housing in the county. The vacant rural residential and destination resort lots. That's what all those maps were about, showing the vacant properties as they stand today. Unincorporated communities, cluster developments. Kyle mentioned those very briefly in his clear and objective report. These are all ways to get housing on the ground now. Measures 37 and 49 claims. Those are, I believe, starting to dwindle at this point, but there are some still out there. It is possible, though difficult, to establish dwellings on both farm and forest zones. They are known as resource zones, but there are ways that I've listed here of obtaining a dwelling. And lastly, and this was not the case in the last time I presented this, is rural ADUs. That has come online since, in between the 2020 report and today. So that's a new and exciting opportunity that has occurred since then. And there's been, I have the numbers, I don't have them in front of me, but I believe about 30 something applications, does anyone know? Something in that order have been applied for thus far in terms of ADUs. Emerging opportunities, so potential opportunities to establish more housing. As we've discussed earlier tonight, the clear and objective standards for rural housing, as Kyle mentioned, this program, however difficult it is intended to create a more clear path for people to develop housing. It's intended to help the development of housing by making it clear and objective. My favorite topic, RVs as rental dwellings. We just, as an FYI, this is still going. This did go before the Planning Commission quite some time ago. I'm set to go to the board actually next week to continue the deliberations. We don't know where that's going to land, but that is another opportunity, potential opportunity for developing a new type of housing, much like the ADU issue was in the past. Audits of county-owned property, excuse me, can present potential opportunities for other types of projects or potential transfers. The Lapine neighborhood planning area remains an opportunity for additional housing development as well. The institutional challenges, and this is evergreen, I would say. These are just the way our system is structured, and you all know this, but the Oregon land use system is very unique, and there's just certain sideboards on this that keep that regulate housing, I'll say it that way. So for instance, recent case law may limit the development of non-resource land opportunities. It does restrict divisions on EFU and forest lands. Again, those EFU and forest lands are really sacred in the Oregon land use system. In addition, the system as it is now, it prohibits new rural residential lands from having minimum lot sizes at less than 10 acres. Obviously, some exist already from previous times. And it severely limits sewers in South County, and that's been an ongoing area of discussion. So these are things that we've been, this is nothing new. We have been dealing with them as a county and as a state for quite some time. But it's just a reminder of kind of the constraints that we have within the system. And that's my brief summary of this report. So our next steps, we offered to the board to update this pretty much essentially every year. There was positive support for that. We will check back in with the board next time this time next year to update this. It's a helpful tool. We think it's a helpful tool. It just gives a general sense of, what's going on. What are the population projections? How many vacant lots are there? Just to give a general broad brush picture of what's on the ground in the county. So I'm happy to answer any questions. We will be posting this online. We're just making a few little edits to the existing copy, and I'll let everybody know where that is posted and just what those updates are. So thank you.
Anyone on the dais that would like to ask a question?
Would,
Commissioners
please,
Camp or Vice Chair?
would Chair Williams, please?
Yes.
Really great read, I have to say, in a monster packet this time round.
We hit it on page, 705.
Yeah. Yeah. No offense, Kyle, yours was kind of a brutal slog, but no offense. But I actually printed this out because I want to save it for a reference, and I am wholeheartedly in support of continuing to update it on a regular basis wherever it makes sense. But a lot in here to say. There's a lot that I learned. Some of it kind of confirmed trends or order of magnitude dollar things that I kind of was aware of. Some of it was surprising and new to me. But all of it was good and useful. I thought it was balanced in its presentation. It was an objective snapshot of kind of where we're at, where we're going based upon projections and trends. A couple things, if you don't mind, since you did such a nice job summarizing it, Tanya, but that caught my eye in particular, if you don't mind. One, is one of the tables that you highlighted. I think it's table 9, but it doesn't matter, colleagues, but the one that looks at number of vacant lots in 2020 and in 2024 in rural residential zones and in rural communities. And the bottom right of that, the total in 2024 is 2,944 vacant lots. And you alluded to the fact that there's a lot in that number. They're not necessarily all, that's a gross number, not a net number. I get that. However, when I look at that number, that 2,944 vacant lots, and I refer back a few pages to the estimated need, housing need, it's in the narrative form there rather than tabular form, but estimated housing need is for 2,077 housing units that may be required to accommodate this growth up until 2047. So when I compare those two numbers, 2,944 existing vacant lots and 2,000, slightly over 2,000 needed up until 2047, looks like we've got as much or more than we need in those kind of gross numbers. And then lastly, it's in the report, but it's called out in the memo up front that summarizes the report. There's this that's just so important that we understand, in my view. It says Deschutes County offers the most rural residential housing opportunities in Oregon, along with Clackamas, Lane, and Jackson counties, based on population outside of UGBs. It has the most resort communities and destination resorts, as well as one of the largest urban unincorporated communities, Sun River. It is also the only county with EFU subzones that allow for the smallest EFU parcel sizes in Oregon. County rates in the top third annually for the number of approved non-farm dwellings. It appears to have the largest number of lots located in rural residential exception areas. Anyway, and in the context of a housing crisis, it sometimes this characterization of this county of in my view, sprawl in urban development that has occurred in this county that is striking amongst the 36 counties in this state gets overlooked. And I am so grateful to see it summarized here. So anyway, but just a lot in here, and very, very interesting and useful. Really support it. Thank you.
Thanks. And, the credit goes to Peter Gutowski for kind of looking at that stuff initially and starting that narrative. I will just, one note is that, with that vacant lands number, if we did a true buildable lands analysis, I think that number would
Sure.
shrink significantly. And I can't tell you by how much, but, so it's a tricky comparison to say, okay, we're good, but yes, your point is very well taken. Yeah, that's the purpose of this report, to kind of look at all that stuff together. So thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
Was it provided what the causes were for the projected reduction in rural living by 2072? Mainly, I see that percentage go from 29% in 2022 to 16%. And I understand that a lot of the infill is going to be inside cities and stuff, but I just find that a surprisingly big decrease. Did they provide any projected causes for the reduction in rural living or rural housing?
Really good question. And we have Peter Gutowski at the table here.
I was just, Commissioner Stockamp, it's another great question. We don't, the Portland State University does not get that granular in their 50-year forecast. We've had conversations internally that we wonder if household size is getting smaller. So, they use a methodology of household size divided, multiplied by the number of households. So, I think that's a trend that's occurring nationally, that there's just fewer, the family unit is getting smaller. And now I'm extrapolating, but there's the number of second homes in rural Deschutes County is a factor today, and one wonders if that's a factor tomorrow. When you look at our resort communities, destination resorts, Sun River, so that's another comment. The other thing that we've seen, and we can, if you're interested, maybe we can get Kyle to come back up. Kyle just released did the analysis for the annual county population estimate. And I think over time we've seen decreases, or maybe it's not decreases. We're seeing average annual growth rates for the rural county much smaller than our cities. And so it's just foretelling, I think, this trend that most of our growth is going into our cities, and the rural county remains its growth rate is smaller than its comparisons. And if you extrapolate that out, I think the demographers are indicating, as noted in the report, that there will be fewer growth as we get into that 50-year cycle. And then at the tail end of that, we may see some decreases. But we have such a significant housing stock, it'll be something that we track, and we don't know what's going to happen over the course of the next 50 years about resiliency with climate change. I say this gently and with not to try to project when this happens, but Cascadia is something that is geologically supposed to happen in 50 years. And if that event were to come, we might see Central Oregon change in ways that no 50-year population projection can predict. So it's intriguing information, as your colleague Commissioner Hokamp noted, and one that we all of us in the community development department, I think, are really intrigued about, and we like to evaluate it on an annual basis for the population estimates and even for this annual housing profile. It's good information, it's good data, and everyone can kind of dissect it according to their own kind of viewpoints and estimates.
Mhm. Yeah, I was also just curious if, I mean, it seems some just because of growing UGBs too. So I was curious if any of that could be added in future of the rural housing profile. I know it's focused on rural housing, but like for instance, Caldera Ranch, if something like that, the
Right.
future, which is all theoreticals right now and stuff, and still needs to. Well, I guess they just had their the city council pass, but kind of is interesting to see where the rural housing is turning into then also.
No, that's a great point, and one that we can build in, the rural, what does it mean for rural ADUs? If the Board of County Commissioners decides that they want to adopt the RVs, the RV amendments where RVs can be used as a rental dwelling, what that indicates. I mean, if that's permanent. So yeah, those kinds of factors I think will be important to at least identify whether or not how they equate into rural housing long-term, I guess will be fluid, but the absorption rate with Ben's urban growth boundaries is a great remark, because the pilot project that you're talking about will lead to some of that absorption, as well as I think in the next 2 to 3 years, the city of Bend wants to do a 20-year urban growth boundary amendment. So that'll further absorb some of the plan amendment zone changes that have occurred, and good information to continue to monitor and to share to kind of tell the story about housing and absorption rates.
Great. Thanks for compiling this report. It is really interesting data.
I think Commissioner Stottkamp's point is what he noted there was an interesting too. It was pretty striking drop. I always say with my students that be careful with percentages because they're tricky things. Tanya, you alluded to table 5 in your summary and looking at average annual growth rates declining in the rural areas as well as in the urban areas. But, a couple things about that. For instance, just take Ben's number going down from 1.7% annual growth rate to 1.4% annual growth rate. Well, number one, it's still growth. And number two, it's a percentage of a larger base. So it's still going to be growing considerably. I know you guys all know that, but percentages are tricky. And when people look at that and they're alarmed, oh, we're going to be slowing down. Well, no, we're not going to be slowing down. We're going to continue growing. And anyway, yeah, really fascinating. Yeah.
No, those are good points. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? All righty, Tanya, we'll let you roll on into the dark skies.
Okay. Here I am. And just one final note, I'll send an email out to the Planning Commission when we've posted that final update. It's just some minor changes in like a footnote and a couple paragraphs. So I'll let you know. Give me one moment here, please. Okay. Hello. Again, for the record, Tanya Saltzman, Senior Planner. This is meant to be a pretty brief update on the Dark Skies project. I provided a memo that I had provided to the Board of County Commissioners a month or two ago concerning the direction of the project. And I'll note that at the joint meeting with the Planning Commission and the board, which was, I believe, October 10th, October 11th, excuse me. We discussed a lot of these issues already, so I don't want to repeat myself, especially as I can feel the roads freezing as I'm inside here. But this is just meant to tell you all where staff is at in terms of this project and coordination efforts and how we're moving forward. So I'll go really quickly. As we know, Dark Skies has been on our radar for quite some time. Basically, this project in some form began in November 2021 with the board and the Planning Commission expressing support for providing updates. Essentially, these updates fall into two components. One is a legislative update to the code itself, and 2 is educational and outreach materials. Gesundheit. So there's been the most recently, staff convened a panel discussion in April 2023. This was the second panel that discussed a lot of dark skies issues, what a legislative update might encompass, what it should not encompass. I have a list of the people who participated in this, including the chairperson from the International Dark Sky Association, which is now called Dark Sky, an astronomer, a representative from Visit Central Oregon, a representative from Central Oregon Builders Association, staff from our code enforcement department, our own Matt Cyrus, who is in representing the farming and ranching community, and a science educator. They were super helpful. And I should note that Tarek Rawlings, our senior transportation planner, was running this project at that time. He was the one who did these panels and did all of the kind of legwork and all of that. I've inherited it. So this panel was great. I watched the recording of it. These people really, they're very passionate about the issue and know a ton about it. And it was just a really balanced, interesting discussion. And very realistic about what can be enforced, what can't, we touched on this a little bit in our joint meeting. So I summarized some of those thoughts that came from that panel. They weren't necessarily representative of a group consensus, but just sort of items that were thrown out there. For instance, we should remove the exception for the shielding for lights on timers. That was an issue that has come up, I think, right in this room, perhaps, where, a light on a timer goes on and off or off after 20 minutes, but then boop, it goes right back on. So how do you deal with that? Let's see. Commissioner Cyrus mentioned that he is very dark skies, pro dark skies. He talked about the measures that they have in place at Aspen Lakes, and it's pretty tremendous. They're very strict about how they manage their dark skies. They do also have people who can enforce it, which therein lies the rub with the difficulties that we could potentially have in enforcing things here. I'll note that in the newly adopted comprehensive plan, there is a policy 510.2, that notes that recommends implementing a dark skies educational and/or incentive program and periodically update the dark skies ordinance to reduce the impacts of light pollution and reduce lighting impacts on adjacent properties. So I think everyone's in agreement that this is important and we need to do something. Just speaking briefly about the existing regulations, this was adopted in 1994. It requires, there's lots of tables with different types of lighting that we envision we might be able to streamline this a bit. It offers examples of compliant shielding and fixture designs. They talk about how the need to direct light downward, limiting the direct line of sight of the fixture's lamp to the property on which the fixture is installed. Again, different types of bulbs have different requirements depending on wattage. There's a lot of exemptions, and this is something that we'll touch on. Some of the things seem important, like airports and aircraft operations, things like holiday lighting, which is interesting. Temporary lighting for carnivals and fairs, again, motion sensitive or timer lights, lighting of flags, television or film productions, agricultural practices. There was some discussion, as we recalled in our joint meeting, about that, and construction. So in terms of the legislative approach, there were lots of suggestions in the panel for how to finesse our existing code to make it better. It's already pretty widely recognized as pretty good. But there were suggestions to finesse it, for instance, addressing color temperature, additional shielding, brightness. There were suggestions to extinguish all lights after 11 p.m. with motion control for security, limits on string lights, reducing night illumination of signs, limiting ornamental lighting to be, or restricting it, to be off when not occupied, prohibit uplighting on trees and shrubs. As you might imagine, some of these are easier than others to enforce, and these were just things that were put on the table. And again, as we've discussed in the past, there are limitations to this with respect to inspection and enforcement. As we know, our building safety division, as well as our code enforcement division, they have a lot, they don't have a ton of capacity. Both of them are, well, particularly code enforcement, their priorities are immediate health and safety issues. There's sewage flowing down someone's lawn, that type of things, or real dangers that they have to prioritize. They have to triage their complaints that they receive, things that impact water, rivers and streams and so forth. So ultimately, lighting complaints do fall sort of to the bottom or towards the bottom of the list. It's also very difficult to enforce. It's a timing issue. Sometimes these things, happen at night. And it's hard to document with photos because photos can be, altered, filtered, whether intentional or not. It's very hard to capture these violations. Sometimes it requires tools to measure, whether it's temperature or brightness, that type of thing. Those can be very easily miscalibrated. They're also quite expensive and require training. So it's tricky. And similarly, the Building Safety Division, they implement their primary job is to implement state building codes. They don't have the capacity to review outdoor lighting. They do acknowledge that this is in our code, and that's usually, I believe it's stamped on the building permits, but it's not a thing that people are going out with a clipboard and checking those things off. So it's tricky. And I think everybody was reasonably on the same page for that. So in general, the consensus from the board and from even some of the panelists is to try to simplify the lighting code and really focus on downward shielding. It seems like a pretty blanket control that could really address a lot of things. There would still obviously be some exemptions for certain types of uses, but our plan is to start with that as kind of the baseline change, with a few nice to haves, as we're putting it, kind of a second tier of potential changes to the amendments that we're going to acknowledge in the memo when it comes time to have a public hearing. And then there's a few things that were recommended that we as staff just don't feel are realistic in terms of enforcement or just regulating that level of light. So we're basically moving things into kind of three buckets, and that's how we're going to structure our amendments. And we are working on those right now. We don't have a date yet for when we're going to have a public hearing, but I would anticipate early in the year. Of course, that will come to the Planning Commission first, and we'll see where that goes. And I think, we've been trying to get this off the ground for a while, and it's been difficult because of capacity, but I think now's the time. We're looking forward to it. And I'm interested in seeing kind of what level of protections people are or are not interested in. Because I know even just at the joint meeting, there was quite a variety of opinions of what people want, how much they want it to be regulated or not. So to be continued. And lastly, besides the legislative updates, we're also going to be working on educational materials and information, recognizing that, as I've just said, enforcement of the actual code is tricky, but education can go such a long way. And people from Dark Skies International, or Dark Skies, have noted this as well. Whether that's us making a really great website that talks about best practices, highlights our code, provides links to other resources, perhaps handouts, things that are attached electronically to building permits when they're kind of running through our system. We're going to be exploring all of those. We're going to also work with Visit Central Oregon and other organizations to try to just get the word out. And I think education can really go a long way and perhaps be even more powerful than just strictly code. Just saying, be a good neighbor. This is how you do it. And that type of messaging, I think, could be really useful. And hopefully we can do something cool and creative with that. So that's the plan. We will be, as I said, we're working on the legislative amendments right now, and we'll keep the Planning Commission apprised of the timing. And of course, at the public hearing and in the open record period will be the opportunity to provide suggestions or comments, questions, etc., about the amendments themselves. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Chair, I've got a question.
Absolutely, Vice Chair.
Just realized it's more of a comment than a question, but I just want to say I'm in support of the approach that you guys as staff appear to be taking. At the joint meeting, I got a sense of maybe where each commissioner was kind of feeling like they're at, and I think that those of us who are just like very adamantly in support of dark skies could do well to consider that maybe having a whole laundry list of regulations is not really going to be appealing to the majority of the members of the board. And I think it would make more sense to consider things that are A, enforceable, and B, just simple and kind of common sense-y, that might reduce conflict between neighbors without seeming overly heavy-handed. So just something I wanted to make the comment just for my fellow commissioners to kind of consider that I really like this 3-tiered approach, because I don't want to get ahead of the process by any means, but just kind of consider what we might be able to appeal to our board, and maybe presenting our thought process in terms of those types of things might be a good idea. So it seems like staff's on it, so I'm not worried, but
Appreciate your vote of confidence.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is tricky to kind of hone in on the appropriate level of regulation in terms of what people want and what's actually doable. So that's where we're trying to get that magic mix. And we're starting with something relatively lean. And then if the overwhelming opinion is, we want A, B, and C, then that's the point of the public process. So.
yep, sounds good.
I add to
And
that?
a little more cost effective maybe for the county.
Yeah. Can I add to that, Chair Williams, please?
Yes, absolutely.
First, I would like to acknowledge my colleague commissioners, Karis and Altman, that have championed this for a long time, before I've been on this group. So thanks for sticking with it, both of you. And I so appreciate Jessica's comments, and I also don't want to get ahead of the process. But I'm encouraged by this coming out of the joint meeting, and just sort of awareness of how this issue has been talked about for a while. I'm so excited that there might be the possibility of moving forward in a way that we don't kind of get, as we normally do, as I'm guilty of, down in our camps and wallow around in acrimony and distrust and agendas and so forth. And everybody seems to be kind of in favor of this. So I'm hoping that we can move it forward. I hope that we can move it forward substantively and meaningfully. And I'm all for the approach as well. Heavy on carrots and education. I would say in regards to code enforcement that, if you'll forgive me 1 second, but I can recall, I think back years and years ago, there was like one code enforcement guy for the county or something like that. Might be an exaggeration. And I think there's more now. And I know it's always a challenge. There's always more that, and so that you have to prioritize as you have it in the packet and so forth. But, priorities reflect kind of where we want to be, and they reflect these larger issues, and light pollution is a big issue. And if we elevate this issue in terms of priority, it will drive the provision of staffing and resources. So please don't shy away too much from some of the regulatory aspect as well. But I'll leave it at that. I agree with Vice Chair Karis's comments that I think staff's got a great start or restart on this in terms of an approach. I would encourage you to go big rather than small, and build on this rare, precious opportunity that we have, where people from across the spectrum are kind of wanting to see this go forward.
Agree that it's interesting that it seems like everyone likes it. It's just the degree of
Sure.
how much we're doing, and those tools that we're going to be using. So that's our job to figure that out. But yeah, I appreciate that. It's an exciting project.
Chair,
Yes.
just one other quick comment, in support of what Commissioner Hopekamp is saying. Sometimes when there are rules written down, even if the county doesn't have the resources at the moment to come out and say, hey, you need to follow the rule. As a neighbor, I can say to my neighbor, hey, there's a rule and it's written down. As it stands right now, the rules are a little bit inadequate in my view, in terms of resolving not just the personal conflict that I have shared about, but other people who have come to present about their experiences with lighting. So there are some sort of loopholes in the rules that really just create more confusion than they do. Even if you're totally anti-regulation, it's like the rules are now in a way that actually makes it more confusing. So I just think that sometimes if there's rules written down, it doesn't even mean that county resources needed to be used to enforce them. Neighbors can say to neighbors like, hey, look, we need to follow the rules around here and here's what the rules are. And, we follow all kinds of rules in our community without them getting enforced. But we do it because we understand we're part of a bigger system and we all have to work together. So
Something we were tossing around, and I don't know where this is going to land, is maybe incorporating recommendations, but into the code. And that's something, Will and I discussed it very briefly. We don't usually do that in the code. It does appear in certain places, but it's a little mushy as to if we want to really put that in our legal code. And we'll probably talk to Stephanie about that at some point, but we're kind of tossing that around in our heads to see, it's in this code. We might not be able to call code enforcement on someone about it, but it's published in the kind of the official thing. So we're trying to see where something like that might land.
very cool.
I'm always interested to read, and I know I'm not the only one that has here either, but the studies that in terms of the safety issue, outdoor lighting and security and all that, I guess there's evidence out there that night lighting actually attracts more burglaries and so forth than it discourages. It's certainly not one way the other way, and says, well, the more well-lit places are more secure. They certainly are, at least from what I've read. And yeah.
Well, Commissioner Cyrus and I are both in agreement. Our properties are both pitch black, but I know someone like Commissioner Altman who has, horses, barn, things like that, coyotes, you need to be able to see where you're going. So I definitely understand that. But are there any other questions for Tanya? Okay, well, with that, we will wrap up that segment. We are now to staff and planning commission comments. Come on up, staff. I feel some of the planners have probably spoken enough tonight.
My notes are removing, so y'all can go first.
For sure. Okay. All right.
Well, panel, there's more of you than there are of us.
Yeah, I just have a couple updates on projects that the Planning Commission was involved in. So we had the two self-storage text amendments, the applicant initiated text amendments. The board completed their hearing process. They ultimately voted 2-1 to deny both amendments. They found that during deliberations, they felt that the proposed use was not compatible with the purpose of the MUA 10 zone. So they directed each applicant team to rather explore a plan amendment zone change to potentially rezone the property. So we haven't heard from either applicant team what their plan is for next steps, but just wanted to let you know that because it was denied, that application didn't move forward. In addition to that, a couple other updates. The comp plan, 2040 plan has been appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals by Central Oregon Land Watch. We have not yet received the petitioner's brief outlining the issues. I think we are planning to expect that within the next couple of months. We're settling the record right now, so should be more updates there. But we look forward to seeing some of the arguments that are presented there and to determine if they can be addressed through minor amendments to that document that was adopted, or if it would need to actually move forward through LUBA. So that'll be interesting to see what's to come there. And then wanted to note that Land Conservation and Development Commission will be holding a hearing on January 23rd, pardon me, to update new sage-grouse maps. So these were maps that were already adopted by the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission in 2023, December of 2023. So they are going to adopt those into the OAR, which is essentially this addressed through our local code. We're required to utilize those maps and enforce rather the regulations in that OAR. Not many changes to that map. It's mostly just more accurate information. They had some collaring data. So we will be keeping an eye on that hearing, and we'll be providing a work session to the Planning Commission on January 23rd with the outcome of that hearing. And if that's adopted, we'll move forward with a zoning amendment to update our sage-grouse combining zone map. So yeah, those are my updates. Thanks.
Okay. I don't have that much to say, except that I think I already noted that the RVs as rental dwellings is going back to the board next week. We'll keep you posted on what happens. We have the deliberations memo is posted online if you're curious to look at it. I guess the most interesting part of it is one of the options now the board asked us to look at different minimum lot sizes. So as you might recall, we had a 1 acre minimum across the board. They asked to explore options of 2 acres and 5 acres in South County, the same as the ADUs, and also look at 5 acre minimum across the board. So we have these as options, and we did some analysis to figure out eligibility in terms of number of properties. So I would say that's the biggest decision point. A lot of other decision points had to do with fire, wildfire mitigation and access and things like that, which have been a bit of a sticky wicket thus far. So we'll see where that goes. And of course, we'll update the Planning Commission with how that goes. I think that's all I have.
Kyle, anything for the good of the order? Nicole, would you speak real briefly to kind of 2 projects that are in the pre-project phase that we've begun thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of items that will eventually be coming your way. We are working on essentially a housekeeping amendment to update our code related to medical hardship dwellings. There's some inconsistency between our code and state statute that actually further limits medical hardship dwellings. So we'll be working on that code to be directly from essentially statute. And then second to that, we received a $25,000 grant from the Department of Land Conservation and Development to explore what we're calling, an urbanization text amendment. Really, the purpose of this is to explore code amendments that would potentially, regulate development adjacent to urban growth boundaries within a certain radius to preserve that land for efficient urbanization in the future. So because we're having quite a few rezoning proposals to rezone land from EFU to MUA 10, there was a desire from some of our board of county commissioners, actually all 3 expressed interest in this project, and City of Bend staff to see if we could explore some amendments to greater preserve that land. The City of Bend will be exploring urban reserves, capital U, capital R, which is, allowed by state law to plan for 50 years, but they likely won't get to that work until 2028, I believe. So this is an exploratory process. We're happy to have the grant funds to support the work. And we're going to have hopefully kind of a kickoff meeting with City of Bend staff. And we're also reaching out to City of Sisters to see if they're interested. City of LaPine has quite a bit of land in their UGB already, and City of Redmond already has urban reserves. So we're reaching out to them, but assume that they probably don't have interest in this project. But yeah, we'll keep you updated on those.
Thanks, Nicole. That covers most of our long range issues. I wanted to just mention previously in meetings, we mentioned that we had in current planning a real unusual situation where we had many planners out on concurrent paternity and maternity medical leave, and everybody's back in the house, and that's really helping out a lot. That was a real glut of work during the summer, and during that time, both Nicole and Kyle honorably returned to their former practices of current planning and really dug us out in a hard time. And I just want to honor and we appreciate that. And it's great to have everybody back, and backlogs are coming down rapidly, and we definitely appreciate our opportunity to engage in all the customer service that we like to, rather than some of the limited opportunities we had when we were swamped. So things are going much better.
Okay, I'll bring us home. Commissioners, just want to recognize not only our current, this is a year in review, just some quick remarks. The current planning staff who doesn't get the opportunity as much, or certainly the frequency that long range, but just a tremendous year that they've had. And you've had an opportunity to, I think, meet Audrey Stewart as an associate planner. So I want to give them their props for a hearty 12 months of development review. With that, we're missing Tarek Rollins, our senior transportation planner, but I want to recognize the long range planning team and Stephanie Marshall, our assistant legal counsel, who has the privilege or misfortune of our duties as assigned to guide this division or this section. And what a tremendous year it's been for long range planning under Will's leadership. This group is as good as it gets, in my opinion, dealing with very complex issues at the rural level. And just very quickly, this year, these planners, dealt with the comprehensive plan update, the RV as rental dwellings. Obviously, we had to update the work plan, the mini storage text amendments, the draft statewide hazard mapping, housekeeping amendments, the flood. You've been debriefed on the floodplain biological opinion, the Deschutes County 2040 action plan. So that was year 2024 in a nutshell, in addition to welcoming Commissioner Stockamp and the reappointment of Commissioner Altman. So we're just so grateful to have this commission as an advisory body. Really, your guidance and direction and independence is duly noted. I want to also recognize a colleague, duties as assigned, Tracy Griffin, who is managing the audio visual. We are transitioning to get regular coverage, but just very grateful for all the things that Tracy does behind the scenes to provide food for the Planning Commission for dinners, and just the support that she provides to our staff. As we look to next year, I just want to have the Planning Commission begin thinking about, I'd say this at the end of December every year. Your next meeting will be on January 9th, and the first item of business will be election of officers. So please think about that. No need to have a conversation now, but Commissioner Williams has dutifully served as chair and Jessica Karas as vice chair. So we're grateful for your leadership. So anyway, with that concludes my remarks. I turn it back over to Chair Williams. Thanks for your guidance this year. And just want to, before the meeting closes too quickly, just want to wish all of you a happy holiday. We really appreciate your service. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I will start with the screen commissioners. Commissioner Stockamp, any comments for tonight?
No additional comments to provide. Excited to hit the ground running in 2025 with the public hearing, the clear objective standards. And just want to wish everyone happy holiday and Christmas season.
Excellent. Commissioner Altman.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to reiterate what I said earlier and apply it to everybody who we work with and staff this year and always, that I am constantly impressed by their professionalism and the depth of knowledge and detail that they go to prepare for every meeting and planning for what happens in the county. So I want to say a big thank you and applause to you, because you really are amazing, an amazing team of people. And I think it's been a great year, and ditto, happy holidays to everybody, and look forward to next year.
Excellent. Commissioner Hofkamp.
Fine meeting. Good stuff tonight. Nice to see the crew here. What a great looking crew, fine crew. Proud to know you, proud to work with you, and colleagues as well. Nice to be a part of it. So thank you.
Vice Chair Karas.
Happy holidays, everybody. I really like these meetings where we kind of celebrate what we've done, and it is really, really wonderful working with you all, colleagues and staff. It's just something that, like you go out and you volunteer and you're like, let me volunteer for something. But I just feel like this whole experience, the people involved make or break a volunteer opportunity. So, and in terms of, I second Peter's comment. We don't need to have a discussion about it now, but I just want to let people know I'm not seeking nominations or would not be open to a nomination to be chair or vice chair. So please think of someone else for that. Yeah. I just think it's a good time to give someone else the opportunity, and let's get some other leaders up here and kind of pass the torch. So please think about who you think would make a good fit for that role.
All right. I am in agreement with not wanting to seek chair again. My husband and I are dealing with some medical issues, so I just don't know that we can necessarily dedicate, well, he can't dedicate, I can't dedicate that time. I would consider vice chair, but I agree with Vice Chair Curris. I think it would be nice to get some new fresh blood. I think the planners are fantastic. You guys just go so in depth. You know your projects that you're on, and you provide all the information. You do it eloquently, precisely. And I'm just going to say something. I was on Nextdoor today. I went back through the last 3 weeks, and I know we have had community state that they cannot find our meetings. And I just feel, because I do see other county postings, be it wildfire things or the county does post on Nextdoor, and I think it could behoove us, like if we want to really have an additional platform. People aren't reading the bulletin. They just don't kind of check that out. So I'm just throwing it out there that maybe we start putting our planning meetings on Nextdoor. A lot of folks look at it and they're on it very quickly. And then other than that, go Clemson against versus Texas in this quarterfinal coming up on December 21st. That's me being biased. I have to admit that. And then otherwise, happy holidays. Happy New Year. See you in the new year. And at 7:40, I will call this meeting adjourned, and we will see everyone on January 9th.
Bye.
Right.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Stay safe.